The rain had not yet started, but Nadia could feel it coming, that particular heaviness in the air that settled over Seoul in the early hours before a storm. She stood at the bus stop on the edge of Gangnam, still wearing her graduation gown, the tassel from her cap clutched so tightly in her fist that the thread had begun to cut into her palm. Her family's car was already 3 blocks away. She could still see the taillights if she squinted hard enough into the gray morning light, but she made herself stop looking. There was no point. They had made their decision clear enough with the $20 bill her stepmother had pressed into her hand like she was paying off a debt. "Consider us even," her stepmother, Farida, had said, her voice flat and final. "You have your degree now. That was the deal. Don't call this house home anymore." Her father hadn't even looked at her. He'd kept his eyes on the steering wheel, his jaw tight, and Nadia had understood in that moment that whatever love he'd once had for her, if he'd ever had any at all, had been spent a long time ago, used up on excuses and silence, and the convenient forgetting that comes so easily to men who choose new families over old promises. She was 23 years old, standing in the rain that had just begun to fall, holding a $20 bill and a diploma in international business from one of Korea's top universities, and she had absolutely nowhere to go. Nadia had not always been unwanted. She still remembered fragments of her mother, a Ghanaian woman named Afro who had come to Korea on a scholarship program and fallen in love with a Korean businessman named Yusuf Park, a man who had spent 2 years working in Accra before returning home. Afro had died when Nadia was 7, a car accident on the coastal road outside Busan, and after that, everything had changed. Nadia's father remarried within 18 months. Farida arrived with 2 children of her own, twins named Sujin and Sumin, and from the very first day, the house that had once smelled like her mother's shea butter and jollof rice began to feel like someone else's home that Nadia was merely borrowing space in. She was never beaten, never screamed at in public. The cruelty was quieter than that, 1,000 small erasures, her photos taken down from the hallway, her allowance misplaced, birthday cakes that arrived a day late if they arrived at all. She grew up biracial in a household that made her feel, every single day, like the visible reminder of a marriage her stepmother resented and a wife she had replaced. But Nadia had been resilient in the way that children who are not loved enough often become resilient. She studied. She excelled. She told herself that if she could just get her degree, if she could just prove she was capable, worthy enough, something would change. Her father would finally see her, would finally choose her. Instead, he had made her stepmother's ultimatum clear the night before graduation. "Get your diploma and get out. We've supported you long enough." Now she stood in the rain, 23, brilliant, and utterly alone. The bus that pulled up wasn't the one she needed. She didn't have anywhere she needed to be, not really, so when the doors hissed open and the driver looked at her expectantly, she simply climbed aboard because standing still in the rain had started to feel unbearable. She sat near the back, her gown soaked through, mascara running despite her best efforts to keep her composure, and stared out the window as the city blurred past in sheets of gray water. That was when she noticed the man across the aisle watching her with quiet concern. He was strikingly handsome in the understated way of someone who didn't seem to know it, or didn't care. Dark hair damp from the rain, sharp jaw, kind eyes that held none of the performative sympathy she'd learned to distrust. He wore a simple black coat, expensive but not ostentatious, and he'd been reading something on his phone before he'd looked up and caught her crying. "Are you all right?" he asked, his Korean gentle, careful, the kind of question people rarely bothered asking strangers. Nadia wiped her face quickly, embarrassed. "I'm fine, just a hard day." He studied her for a moment longer than was probably polite, taking in the soaked graduation gown, the $20 bill still crumpled in her hand, the utter lostness in her expression. Something shifted in his face, not pity but recognition, as if he understood loneliness when he saw it because he'd worn it himself once. "I'm Kang Min-ho," he said simply. "I don't usually talk to strangers on buses, but you look like someone who could use a friend today." Nadia almost laughed at the absurdity of it, being comforted by a stranger on public transportation on the worst day of her life, but something in his sincerity disarmed her. Nadia, she said quietly. And you're right, I could. What Nadia didn't know yet, what she wouldn't learn for weeks, was that Kang Min-ho was not simply a kind stranger riding the bus. He was the heir to Kang Industries, one of Korea's largest conglomerates, a man who had spent the morning slipping away from his family's driver because he'd needed air, needed to feel like a normal person for even 1 hour before returning to a life of boardrooms and expectations he'd never fully wanted. He didn't tell her any of this. Not yet. Instead, he simply asked, "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Nadia's silence answered for her. Min-ho didn't push, didn't pity her aloud, didn't make her feel smaller than she already did. He simply said, "There's a small guest house near Hongdae. My cousin runs it. It's clean, safe, and she owes me a favor. Let me help you get settled somewhere warm, and then you can figure out the rest." Would you do that for a stranger? He looked out at the rain-streaked window, something distant and tired in his expression. "Because I know what it feels like to be given up on by the people who were supposed to love you. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone, and I definitely wouldn't leave someone alone in it if I could help." Nadia searched his face for the catch, the ulterior motive, the price that was always attached to kindness in her experience. She found none. Just quiet steadiness and something that felt absurdly like safety. She said yes. The guest house was small but immaculate, tucked into a quiet alley away from the noise of Hongdae's nightlife. Min-ho's cousin, a warm woman named Yoo-jin, asked no questions when he explained the situation, simply handed Nadia a towel and a spare set of clothes and told her the room was hers for as long as she needed. "You didn't have to do this," Nadia said to Min-ho later, sitting across from him in the guest house's small common room, a cup of warm barley tea between her palms. "I know," he said. "I wanted to," considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. "Because you looked like someone who'd been told her whole life that she wasn't worth helping, and I don't think that's true. I think you're worth a lot more than a bus stop and $20. Something in Nadia's chest cracked open at that, not painfully, but like a window finally letting in air after being sealed shut for years. She hadn't realized how starved she'd been for someone to simply see her as valuable without conditions attached. "You don't even know me," she said, half laughing, half crying. "No," Min-ho agreed, "but I'd like to." Over the following weeks, Nadia began rebuilding a life from nothing. Min-ho helped her find work, first a temporary position at a small import-export firm, using the business degree her family had so casually discarded her for once she'd earned it. He never made her feel indebted to him, never used his help as leverage, and slowly, Nadia found herself trusting someone for the first time in longer than she could remember. She learned things about him too, in fragments. That he loved photography but rarely had time for it. That he'd lost his mother young, much like she had, and that his father had remarried a woman who, unlike Farida, had genuinely tried to love him but could never quite fill the specific shape of grief he carried. That despite every outward marker of success, Min-ho often felt like a placeholder in his own family story, expected to inherit a legacy he'd never chosen, loved conditionally for what he could produce rather than who he was. "We're not so different," Nadia said one evening, the two of them sharing tteokbokki from a street cart near the Han River, the city lights reflecting gold and red across the water. "Both of us performing for love we're not sure is real." Min-ho looked at her for a long moment. "I don't perform for you," he said quietly. "I don't have to." Confession sat between them, warm and fragile, and Nadia felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. It was another 2 months before the truth came out, not through Min-ho's own confession, but through a gossip article Nadia stumbled across while scrolling through her phone late one night. Kang Industries heir spotted with mystery woman, the headline read, beneath a blurry photo of the two of them walking along the river. Nadia stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. She read further, about Kang Industries, about the family's wealth, about Min-ho's position as heir apparent, about the arranged engagement his father had been quietly negotiating with the daughter of a rival conglomerate for over a year. She confronted him the next day, hurt evident in every word. "You let me believe you were just an ordinary man on a bus." "I am an ordinary man," Min-ho said, his voice tight with something like desperation. That title doesn't define who I am to you. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to want me, not the company, not the money. Do you understand how rare that is for someone like me? You still lied. Omitted, he corrected gently, because I was afraid of exactly this, of you looking at me differently, of losing the one person who's seen me as just. Minho. Nadia's anger warred with understanding, because she knew intimately what it felt like to be valued only for what you could offer rather than who you were. Still, trust once cracked took time to mend, and she needed space to think. I need time, she told him, and for the first time since they'd met, she walked away from him. The following weeks were quiet, painful in their own particular way. Nadia buried herself in work, watched her small apartment, finally her own, rented with her own earned money, slowly become a real home. She missed Minho fiercely, but she also, for the first time in her life, was learning to build stability on her own terms without depending entirely on anyone else's rescue. It was during this time that her father resurfaced. He called her out of nowhere, his voice hesitant in a way she'd never heard from him. I saw the article, he said. About you and the heir. Nadia's grip tightened on her phone. Is that why you're calling? Because you saw I might be valuable now. The silence on the other end confirmed everything she needed to know. I'm your father. You stopped being my father the day you let Farida hand me $20 and drove away, Nadia said, her voice steadier than she expected. I don't need you to see my worth now that someone else already has. I found it myself. She hung up before he could respond, and for the first time she felt something close to peace rather than grief in cutting that final tie. Minho, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. He confronted his father directly, refusing the arranged engagement outright, willing to risk his inheritance for the first time in his life over someone, that actually mattered to him. Throw away everything for a woman you've known a few months, his father demanded. I'd throw away an empty life for a chance at a real one, Minho replied. I've spent my whole life being what this family needed. I'm not doing that anymore. His father's fury was long and loud, but underneath it something else stirred, an old, buried respect for a son who had finally found the courage to want something for himself. Nadia and Minho found their way back to each other slowly, deliberately, this time with full honesty between them. He told her everything, every complicated piece of his family, his fears, his hopes. She told him about her mother, about the specific loneliness of growing up unwanted in her own home, about how badly she needed to prove her worth to people who would never actually see it. I don't need you to prove anything to me, Minho said, holding her hands in the golden light of a Seoul evening. I already know exactly what you're worth. What's that? She asked, tears gathering despite her best efforts. Everything, he said simply. You're worth everything. A year later, Nadia stood in a different kind of gown, not a graduation robe, but a wedding dress, ivory and simple, her natural curls crowned with delicate white flowers instead of a tassel. Minho waited for her at the end of the aisle, his eyes wet with the kind of emotion he'd spent a lifetime suppressing for the sake of appearances. His family attended, finally, quietly proud despite themselves. Nadia's father did not receive an invitation. Some bridges, once burned, were better left as ash. But Eugene was there, the cousin who had given a stranger shelter on the worst night of her life. And so were the coworkers who had become genuine friends, the community Nadia had built entirely from scratch after being discarded by the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. As she walked toward Minho, Nadia thought of that rainy bus stop, the $20 bill, the hollow finality of her stepmother's voice. She thought of how her family had been so certain she would disappear quietly into whatever hardship awaited her, how they had never expected, had certainly never wanted, to see her rise into anything at all. They would never know how close their carelessness had come to breaking her. They would also never know that it had, in the end, freed her to build something far more beautiful than anything they could have offered. Minho took her hands as she reached him, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. He whispered. Nadia smiled, genuine and unguarded, the smile of a woman who had finally found a home that wasn't conditional, a love that didn't require her to earn it. Never been more ready for anything, she said, and as they exchanged vows beneath a golden Seoul sunset, Nadia understood, finally and completely, that being left behind by people who couldn't see her worth was never the same as being worthless. Sometimes the cruelest abandonments cleared space for the truest belonging. Her family had dumped her at a bus stop with $20, certain they'd never have to think of her again. They had been right about one thing: they never saw her again. But everyone else who mattered did. And that was more than enough. Welcome to Korean romance tales where love, passion, and emotional stories come to life. If you enjoyed this romantic story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.